Frank Petzold, VFX supervisor for All Quiet on the Western Front. This is obviously based on a famous book that's also inspired by a real life event. So what were your conversations like when you joined the film with Edward Berger?
Well, it was interesting because Ed and I, we've done a show before together. We did The Terror together. So we sort of knew how each other, how we tick and what Ed wants, and he knew how I work and all that. So he called me up and basically started with, do you want to, bring the band back together? I want to do All Quiet on the Western Front. And there was a big gulp because it's such a historical and literary iconic book that so before you start thinking about VFX or technology or how we're going to do it, it's your first thought is like, oh my God, you really want to touch that? Because it's such an important book, and especially with the current events. So it was sort of, right away, when the first passes of the script came out, we met very quickly with all the departments, SFX, makeup, and costume, because we all knew that this thing had to be, in VFX, you want to usually be bigger, be louder, have the newest stuff and all that stuff. But we knew right away that this is material where the actor has to shine and everything else has to sort of take a step back. And I think the biggest challenge for us was really just to make sure that we do everything perfect. And so that not only the acting can shine in the foreground, but that we also historically and photographically, it has to be absolutely perfect. It can't be another, big, loud war movie, which is for a VFX artist hard to do. Because we all have those moments where we go, oh, wouldn't it be great? And oh, let's do this, and how about a view from the blah plane when this happens? We didn't want to do that. And also we had to operate on a European budget. It was still quite a big budget, but it wasn't like the big studio budgets. So we sort of came up with a plan or with an approach. And for myself, from my side in VFX, I sort of had to remind myself of the olden days, sort of trying to go back to the roots where, I started with an optical background and then moved into CG, where we really had to, and also tried to do everything in camera. And if it's not in one pass, well, then you have to do 10 passes and really make sure that everything is set up right so that you can add stuff on the day, maybe even as short as an hour later on another piece of the location, and redo the extra elements, because we knew that we really wanted to put the responsibility of the look in photographic elements. There is a boatload of CG and simulations and models, and we scanned everything in there, but we sort of tried the opposite approach. Rather than adding photographic elements to make the CG blend in, we wanted to do the opposite. We wanted to build everything photographically, and then sort of mend it with CG. Of course, there's digital matte paintings and planes and tons of tanks. But you will see that later in the breakdown. It's there's a lot of stuff where, well, I'm looking at my own poster, but Starship Troopers, and that was an approach that we did. And of course, the producers don't want to hear that because it takes a long time on set.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And also, the other thing I did is right away I sort of pulled that tooth with the producer, with Malte Grunert, who was very open to everything. I said, we're going to be shooting on a huge location. Can I please have a piece? I want to have an outdoor green screen stage. So where I did additional explosions, and I shot hours or a month worth of running soldiers on treadmills with 6 cameras from different angles.
Oh my God.
Because we didn't want to do CG.
You didn't want to just like expand the depth in afterwards, right, in post. And but like,
Yeah.
I do like when you what you were saying before about you not wanting to just go big with the explosions. Like it is very apparent when you watch the film, because it's kind of, it's a lot more immersive, like from this like Paul's POV, the soldier's POV, and it's very visceral. Like you feel like you're literally in the trenches with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the explosions, the all the additional stuff that we did is all real. I mean, real as different passes that we put on later on. We didn't do, we stayed away from CG simulations or particle simulations.
So in terms of like the battlefields, like what was the set like? Like how big was the actual battlefield, and then how much did you have to extend?
Well, the battlefield was quite huge to begin with. I mean, for a movie battlefield, but of course we shot at an airport as an abandoned airport in Czechoslovakia. But of course, James' friend loves to use, we shot on 65, and he loves to use those big wide angle lenses. And then of course, at some point you see the runway, you see the green field. And Edward always wanted the battlefield, he wanted it so open and wide that you never see the end of it. At the same time, what sort of became our friend was lots of smoke. I have to admit there's a bunch of CG smoke in there, but there's also like burning stuff, just to make it so open that it's almost claustrophobic again. I just remember diving for the first time, and sometimes when you just got blue around you, even though it's infinity, you feel claustrophobic. And that was a feel that we wanted to achieve. So, and of course you have windy days, especially on an airport. So yeah, it was a roto nightmare.
I really like the weather aspect of it too, because there was a lot of fog, very foggy, and there's also snow too. And yeah, you're right, like it does feel very claustrophobic. You don't know what's around you.
That's really the thing. Yeah. And we used smoke to connect locations, like smoky backgrounds in certain patterns. And then there's a sequence where he's fighting. There's a one-on-one fight with the Frenchman in a crater where you only see the horizon from looking up. And so we use those same smoke pattern to make sure that there's a proximity to where the battle just took place. But it's funny that you talk about weather. Of course, especially at the time that we're shooting and where we're shooting, you can't really predict the weather. And there's one sequence where there's steel and egg. And I've never had that happen to me on set. We started with a beautiful snowy day, and it was like Christmas-like flakes. It was gorgeous. But come noon, sun came out. All of a sudden, it was like a candy commercial. It was green, and all the snow was gone. So that became a huge visual effects problem in the end. That because the opening scene was so gorgeous that we decided on set, you know what, reshooting this in the same weather, that would be a shame to throw that stuff away. So we put it on VFX to sort of extend the stuff. Of course, with the help of SFX, with Camille in Prague. And I think, for the entire shooting period, I had meetings with SFX every night, just going, okay, you do this bomb, I do that bomb.
Well, that's the other thing, because it's like when they explode or like the gunfire, you have to figure out, where things land or how like bodies react or like what limb flies off. Right. Yeah.
And again, it's like you have to stay true. The book is so important. And Malte, our producer, also wanted to make sure that this film will hold up as an educational film for future generations. If you're thinking about joining the army, you better watch this movie. And in VFX, when you get to do a wound, everybody's rubbing their hands.
It's like blood. Yes.
I'm an old tippet guy, so we always went overboard. So this time we really I had to look up World War I wounds to really make sure that this is right. It doesn't, overpower the moment. It still stays with the actor. I mean, those kids, they were out there fighting for 2 years, and the front line has changed maybe 100 yards. So you really see it, and also the makeup, you see it in their faces, and so you had to really stay true to what it was, and then also just the fact that this is the first technical war, so it's the first time they see a tank.
Well, yeah, that sequence is incredible when it just like slowly comes up above like the frame. And so what was that sequence like? Did you have a real tank? And then like what part of that was like VFX?
We had a real tank. It was built on top of an old tank from the 70s or something like that, because those old French Saint-Chamond tanks, they were so huge and you could put anything under there. But of course, it couldn't really drive through the battlefield that Christian Goldbeck built and excavated and dug out. So we were able to drive a few yards with them, and just one tank. So, and I wanted to always save it for the close-ups, because as soon as you have the interaction and they're bombing people out of that tank, and so we used that one. I still had CG models though to be able to, even though we shot it on the plate, to do stuff with it, because I love projects where there's a creature in it, but this time around I didn't have a creature. So right away in the first production meeting, I was like, you know what, I'm going to elect this tank to be my creature. And there's a few moments when they break through the fog and they see it for the first time and they don't know what it is. And that was
it's like a monster.
Exactly. It was a key for animation, is like really have it break through like a monster and then sit there. And there's a Mexican standoff. And then, the tank does something. What can a tank do? Well, he can lower his gun. And that's sort of those kind of things. I mean, it sounds silly, but it really became our creature. And then, of course, you have the other stuff, which is horrible, like the flamethrowers. They were first invented at that time. And so it's horrible things to be working on. At the same time, it's interesting because you want to be accurate and you really want to do a historic document. And the other thing is, we had long takes. So it wasn't the typical pace of editing that you see nowadays, which was I absolutely loved. And I remember going to James Friend every other day, the DOP, and I'm like, my first thing is always just to discuss what is the camera doing in terms of movement. And he's just not static. And I would walk away and I'm like, now I never get that. The good old lock off, and there it is. And sure enough, they worked so well because it was a pleasure for the artists to work on a shot that you can actually enjoy, and you can see the detail, and it would sit on the
right. You don't have to go like cut back and forth and all that. And
yeah, it's sort of and it's not those super fast cuts all the time, and you can actually enjoy your work. It was sometimes horrible, and then so there's a lot of sequences where I remember in post-production sitting in the theater with the crew, and you want to do your usual action comments. It's like, throw a little bit more of this in there, and no, this doesn't read enough, and just have them blow up. And you really had to sort of go back, and it felt horrible, giving notes almost, because it was such a hard subject to talk about.
The final product is incredible, and I do think you guys are achieving your goal of having the film stand the test of time and showing the atrocities of war. So, Frank, it was great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you back here in a little bit.
All right.
Thank you so much. Joe Letteri, Senior Visual Effects Supervisor on Avatar, The Way of Water. You and your team really reinvented the wheel with the first Avatar. And I know James Cameron held a summit 13 years ago to talk about the sequels and what you guys can do better. So what did you guys discuss during that summit?
The biggest part of it, since we didn't really know what the story was more about the process. Like on the first film, Jim really had this idea that he wanted to be able to do the digital part of the movie and the film part of the movie in the same way, which is why we came up with this idea of, using a virtual camera. And so that Jim could actually shoot his actors on the performance capture stage and see them, in situ in the world of Pandora, at least a very low as representation of that. And what that means practically is he's kind of pre-building the whole film in that virtual world. So there's a lot of data that needs to come back to us to get the final shots as close to what he is laying down that blueprint for, which we called a template. So the early discussion was really, like highly technical. It was about building out that pipeline. Later on, once we knew what the story was, the discussions became more about how are we going to achieve the specific effects that we need? Water obviously being a big one, but characters, a lot more characters with speaking parts in this film, a lot more varieties of characters, old, new, young, different species. So what we were doing kind of evolved. But yeah, overall, we have not stopped working on it since that postmortem. But the actual final push on the film when, Jim started doing the performance capture and we started getting heavily involved with the specifics of this film was about 5 years ago. So we've been working on it, pretty heavily.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting because I know you guys came up with so many new tools during the process. So even when you started working 5 years ago, there's stuff now that you could have used back then, right? When you
yes, and we were also anticipating it. Like on the first film, if you know anything about CG lighting, up until that point, it's a lot of point lights, very localized light sources. It's kind of like lighting on a stage. That film was all about being outdoors, and that kind of lighting wouldn't work. So we adapted this technique called spherical harmonic lighting that had been primarily introduced for games to do that global illumination. But after completing that film, we realized that wasn't going to be enough. So we decided to write our own path tracer, which is the renderer that makes the final images. And that development went through, we tested it on the Hobbit films, we tested it on the Apes films. It's something that we've been building up to what we were going to need for this film, just because we knew it was coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that iterative process. I know you, having worked on Alita, Battle Angel, used that to pioneer the new facial animation technology.
Well,
right?
Not quite. Alita was the end of the old facial system. Mm-hmm. At that point, we realized that for the fidelity we needed and for the number of characters, the way we had been doing it wasn't going to suffice. When I say the old facial system, it's the technique we first developed to do Gollum, and we had been, for Lord of the Rings, and we'd been carrying that through. But for this film, we wrote an entirely new facial system based on a neural network that could understand the relationship between muscles and skin and what you're seeing on the face. And that became the animation tool that we used for the facial system. We would capture the actors with a stereo camera rig and pull information from that, feed it to this network to understand what the muscles were doing, and use that to drive, the characters. And then on top of that, the animators had access to the exact same set of muscles. It was a very a much more intuitive way of working than we had before. And so they would do the final polish and anything that needed to be done to put it together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it just really makes it so much more emotionally truthful when you could see the muscles, the intimate details in their face when they're speaking or just moving or smiling.
Exactly. With the old system, it was really hard to avoid kind of moments where it would look rubbery. You'd have to catch them and, by eye and really just try to iron them out, but your tools were limited. This system is much more true to how a human face actually works. So it gave the animators a lot more, kind of direct control on making that performance come through, because as much as you're capturing the actor's performance, but you're putting on a new character. So there's always a bit of interpretation that we have to do so that emotionally you feel the same way when you're watching the final performance as you do when you're watching the actors give the performance. And that's always our goal, is to maintain that emotional, connection, because really the main characters of this story are all CG characters, right? So that drama is something that we always look to carry through.
Mm-hmm. And I know you also developed something to create more realistic hair. Is that right?
Yeah, hair again is just one of those things that is, kind of tricky to get right, and so we wrote new tools for that as well, and especially because we had the characters spend so much of the time in the water. Like traditionally, we've all built tools like this to get characters running or flying or doing things in the wind. But, when you're in the water, your hair is floating differently. When you dive in the water, it's subject to different forces. When a character comes out of the water and you've got all that water like draining off their hair and back into the ocean, those are the kinds of things that we spent a lot of time on, writing new tools and really trying to get that believability. Water's tricky because you have things like droplets coming off of hair, dropping into an ocean that is, hundreds of kilometers across for what you might see visually. And so it's getting all those scales to work together required a whole new suite of tools that we wrote just to deal with water. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's in the title, so.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, the internet lost its mind over a clip of, Jake Sully tying the strap. And like he's sitting on the surface of the water, and people were like, "Oh my God, was that real, or how much was that CG?" And it was a mix.
So that was a mix, but the one of Jake tying the strap was real. Like that was an actor, with blue makeup. Like Jim really wanted to do that, to get that detail right. But everything around it, like from the arms up, like say from the wrist up, we had to put that and attach it to the CG character. We had to split in the water line with what was shot real. There was a lot of handwork to make that happen. Plus, we're shooting everything in native stereo, so that makes the work a little, less forgiving. And so we had to deal with all those factors. But the idea that Jim had is like you have these moments of reality mingled in throughout, and it really forces you to lock down the realism. Like there's no shortcuts that you can take, because it has to, it all has to match. Like one of the things that was different in this film than the first film is we had a human character, which is, Spider, the kid, in a lot of the shots that would otherwise have been all CG. And again, that forces you to lock everything down from what, Russell Carpenter was doing when he shot those and did the lighting for it, to what we had to do to integrate it. Because again, that's all, there's a lot of blue screen for his elements, but that's all shot in native stereo as well. So, integrating all that is part of what makes it work. Mm-hmm.
And just filming underwater in general, I know you guys, there were 2 tanks, right, that you worked with?
Yeah, there were 2 tanks. So there was a performance capture tank that was done, for the shots of the Na'vi, the Metcalina, which are the village people, when they're diving in the water, when they're swimming around, anything they're doing underwater, we captured in that tank. Then when we were shooting live action, there was another tank, and that was used primarily for the shots of Spider in the water, because a lot of that, was live action. And then we would put the 2 together, because when Jim was doing the performance capture takes early on with the virtual camera, he had Spider in there, Jack, who played him, was in there. And so he played all those moves with the characters live. And then when it came to shoot his part, whether it was, in a set or on a tank, he had already been through it. So he kind of had one of the best rehearsal sessions that you can imagine, for pulling that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, this movie also has some new creatures, the Tulkun, the Ilu, the skimwing, right? So what went into designing those, because they resemble some of, real world creatures like whales and dolphins, but
yes,
exactly.
Exactly. I think anytime you're doing creature design, you want those touchstones of, does an audience recognize something similar? Like on the first film, we had like the dire horses, which were basically horses, but with 6 legs, right? So you try to create some familiarity while at the same time you're bringing something new to it. So, that was mostly Dylan Cole, who was one of the production designers, designing those creatures, but obviously side by side with Jim, because Jim is a fantastic artist in his own right. He will draw exactly what he wants, and that's what it has to look like, when you're done with it. But then, we would pick it up with Dylan, with Richie Bainham, Dan Barrett, our animation team, because every character is defined by motion. The look only gets you so far because it's never static. Is it going to move believably? Is it going to propel itself believably? What does it look like from all different angles? And especially with the Tolkien, because there's so many shots, specifically with Payakan, who was the one that Loak befriends. He's giant. He's much bigger than a whale, but Loak is sitting next to him, and they're kind of conversing. And he's only got an eye in frame because that's all he could fit in frame. So we had to do a lot of animation with just that eye to get the bonding, to get moments where they were connecting, moments where there was fear, any of that. So I think our animators enjoyed working with that because it's very minimal. So you really have to, nudge everything.
And in the same way, how the performance capture, you want it to be emotionally truthful, and now you're able to with the new technology. I think even with these creatures you're creating yourselves, I was fully invested in Payakan because I was I care so much about this creature, and it's it feels real because it's just a testament to what you guys did with him.
Well, thank you. But you know what? It's also a testament to the story. I think sometimes Jim doesn't get enough credit for this, but a lot of that is in the writing. It's like you feel that emotion because he takes us through that whole story progression and builds up to it. And you understand how it's going. I mean, you've got, Loak, who's the teenager, the number 2 son trying to find his place. And always screwing up, and you've got this other outcast Payakan who has screwed up big time. They naturally form a bond together. It's those things we're all familiar with, so the visual effects allows us to tell the story in a different way. I'm sure we've all seen stories with that kind of thing in it before, but not in this way. And that's the thing that I really like about doing visual effects, is that you can open up, your eyes and hopefully an audience's eyes to something that they may be quite familiar with, but allow everyone to see it in a new way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of eyes, I don't know, when you're watching the movies, I don't know if it registers to people that Na'vi are really tall. And I know Sigourney Weaver's now she's a teenager, Curie. She's supposed to be 7 feet tall, right?
Yes.
So how did you guys, I know you guys did something different with the eye line in terms of how you shot it when she was in scenes with other characters. So what did that entail?
Okay, this is when we're shooting live action, right? If we're shooting on the performance capture stage, they're playing to each other. And if the heights are different, like Sigourney's, actually fairly tall, but if she's supposed to be, 2 foot smaller than, say, Jake, we adjust that eye line afterwards. That's a pure animation thing. We adjust it as part of the body and facial performance. When we were shooting live, though, and this was primarily, for shots with Spider in it, because we had captured everything beforehand and knew what the performances would be, Jim wanted something more sophisticated than running around with tennis balls. He wanted it to be much more accurate and much more performance driven. So what we had on set was an eyeline system, a cable camera that we just pulled the tops off of each of the sets and ran this cable camera around. And the cable camera had a video monitor hanging off of it. And it had on that monitor the performances for whoever he was playing against. If it was a shot with Quaritch, it would have Stephen Lang's performance. If it was with Curie, it would have Sigourney Weaver's performance. And this, because again, Jack had played all that as himself on the performance capture stage, he'd been through it all. So this gave us accurate eye line, which was great because, again, we were shooting native stereo. That really helped because we didn't have to do those normal kinds of adjustments that you usually have to do to compensate for the tennis ball not being in the right place. So it gave us a lot performance-wise that was really helpful.
That's awesome. Well, lastly, where are you guys at with the sequels?
We are started. We are underway. Yeah. As usual, we hope that we would have been starting, earlier to get a little heads up on it. But everyone who's worked in visual effects knows deadline is the deadline, and you throw everything you can to get to get it on screen when the movie comes out. So we always have the best of intentions of overlapping, but it never works out that way.
And there'll definitely be new advancements by the time 3 comes out.
Probably because, like Jim was saying a couple of weeks ago, it's like, okay, well, I think we finally know how to make this movie. And it's like, okay, let's apply that to the next one. Yeah.
Well, Joe, it's great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
And
Joyce.
you get to stay on because
Okay.
we'll come back now.
All right.
Welcome to our Meet the Experts visual effects panel. Today, we're joined by Frank Petzold from All Quiet on the Western Front and Joe Letteri from Avatar: The Way of Water. Thank you both for joining us. You both have very extensive careers, and visual effects have advanced so rapidly, even in the last 5 years, 10 years. Is there a tool that exists now that you wish had existed back in the day for one of your earlier jobs?
Well,
Go ahead, Frank.
well, if I think back to the early jobs where, you basically, nobody really knew how it was working, and you pulled people from other fields. You had the old, the stop motion animators trying to work with computers and all that stuff. So, and the same thing goes for just bringing the stuff into the computer and digitizing and all that. And one thing that I'm always so happy about, for me, especially when I'm on set, is that the whole camera tracking issue and all that stuff, it's gotten so much easier for me that I can bring the stuff back to the shop and we can right away work on stuff. And just, thinking back 20 years, it was like you had to go through all the stuff to really, have to rebuild everything that's on set, just even if you want to put just one CG character in there, and it's like, oh, where's the ground? And like Joe was saying, there was the spotlights, and it was like lighting in outer space. If you had a light and behind the, in the shadow, there was nothing. So that stuff, or the HDR pictures, the global illumination, that stuff that really made it easier, and I think it gave the artist more time to do the stuff that they need to do. I think that was one important thing. Unfortunately, sometimes it gets that new tech. Every time there's a new technology, people think, oh, that must be cheaper now. But no.
That costs money.
No, they just ask for more of it.
That's the thing, So
Yeah. Look, I think as an example, Joyce, I'll go back to the first Avatar. We spent about a year doing the first scene where, for us, it was the first scene where Jake is wandering lost through the woods, and Leteri's up in the tree, and she's about to shoot him, and the wood sprite comes down, and she changes her mind. So that took us about a year to do. And after we finished that film, like 2 years later, or as we were near the end, we thought, okay, we've learned so much about it. Let's take, all the advancements we've done and go back and redo that first scene. And so we did, and it didn't look as good. Because you have to remember that it's not just the tools, it's the artistry. Everyone puts their time into making it look as good as possible, using whatever tools they have available. And there's a kind of a magic that we hope comes out of that. And sometimes you can get a better tool, but not get a better result. And that was really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the next big thing is not always what's best for a specific scene, really.
Well, it's not that so much as that the artists are working with the tools that they have to make the image as good as possible, and they create little things to make it work that are hard to recreate. Like a year later, we've got new tools, go back and make it look like that. That's harder than it looks.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love having both of you here because your films they're extraordinary, but they're so different, because All Quiet is so grounded in realism, and Frank, you were talking about like how you wanted you wanted minimal CG, and it has to be the photorealistic, everything you added on. And Joe, you guys obviously created an imaginary world that feels very real when you watch the film. So, but in both cases, it's almost like you want the effects to feel invisible and almost seamless. Is that how you would describe it?
I think it's more Like for us, we didn't want it to feel invisible because we were doing the main characters. We
Yeah.
wanted you to see it. But the effects, really all it comes down to is it's serving the story. You can't have good effects without good story. So like Frank, I love the film because it drew you right into it. And the effects, you know, what you guys did that. It brought you into that world, and that's what it needed to do, because in the end you want to come out saying, I love that film, and not necessarily knowing why. But you know, and if if you do it properly, that's what you're after.
I think, you know, a good since we're shooting in Prague, for example. I mean, I was, you know, the old Barrandov studios there, and Carl Siemens' first animation stuff and everything. And you look at the stuff, or you have kids look at the stuff, and it's so crude, and you know, you see it's not even matte lines. It's like, you know, pictures that you put up and the animations and everything. But the story was so good, it didn't matter. I mean, it's
Exactly.
like 5 minutes, you switch off and you're in the story. And that's something that is sort of, you know, I mean, I'm glad that it's sort of coming back, that people enjoy movies again, because there was a time when it was all about analyzing stuff. You know, it was, I think it was the time when sort of, you know, stuff was, you could pause on the internet. I actually remember, I think it was in 2000 when Arriflex came out with the location projector, and you can actually stop on a frame when you were running film and it wouldn't burn up.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is the end of VFX, because usually you would just loop the film and you go, you like it?
Yeah, exactly.
It'll work, you know? And now it's like, oh, can you just go back 2 frames? What's that there? And it's like, it doesn't matter. You know,
yeah, exactly. Digital was supposed to make it easier, but it turns out like having a lab cutoff was actually really handy. It meant you could go home at night.
Exactly.
Well, before we started, we were kind of joking that, you know, the common refrain you hear in film is like, oh, you can fix it in post, but you know, because it's like they don't have time or money or whatever, or you just want to move on. But you guys are in post. So do you guys think the opposite? Like, no, you guys, we need to get this right in prep, or try to get as many, you know, shots as possible of the scene? Like Frank, you were talking before, like you were shooting something, you did 10 takes of like certain scenes, right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
yeah.
It's sort of, I mean, of course, it depends on the subject matter. You know, it's like you said, it's like Avatar is different from All Quiet. And you have to, of course, in All Quiet, you had to sort of front load stuff on set, where in Avatar, you had to make sure that you have the right tools in post and all that stuff. But I think in general, it never hurts to shoot more on set, even if it's just a reference, because I mean, I'm sort of joking with the artists, is that they come into the studio and they leave when it's dark at night, and then we expect them to come up with photorealistic stuff in the computer, and it's like the poor guy hasn't seen the light of day in 3 months. It's like creativity has to come from somewhere. You know, those people need time to play, to recreate the stuff, and also have ideas, and that's something that I hope is gonna get better, where visual effects artists are given time to experiment, and usually it was in between shows. There was always a little time where you would do R&D, or you play a little bit. Hey, look what I can do. And now it's, you know, one of them, like Joyce.
Yeah, the visual effects isn't really post-production anymore. Like, you know, in the early days, it'll be like the visual effects team, the director, and the you know, and say in the art directors. And then you go through this whole big production phase, and you've got, you know, hundreds of people on set, and you're shooting all this stuff. And at the end, it's the visual effects team, the director, and the editors. It's like, you know, you're there the whole time if you're making a visual effects film.
Mm-hmm, sure. What is a common misconception about your job?
Oh, that we're technicians, I think. That's something that sometimes I wish. I mean, I'm always happy to be on a set where you get included with the director, and the director, you know, is discussing shots with you, and you have ideas, and but there's also projects where you're sort of seen as a technician who just do it.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard for people who are not in this business to understand what we do. And I get that. It's kind of a weird thing that we've attached ourselves to. But I remember when the first Lord of the Rings came out, there were comments we were seeing like, where'd you get the little guy, for Gollum? It's like, it's hard for people to imagine that there's nothing real that you're seeing. Even the first Avatar, it's like, okay, well, you put blue makeup on these people. It's like, no, this is like, these are full 3D characters in a full 3D world. And we inhabit that in our lives daily. Frank, you're used to this. We're all used to that. But if you're looking at it from the outside, it's not something people think about. So you can understand why they would have these misconceptions and try to relate it to what they do know. I think that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, sometimes it's sort of, I'm thinking it's my own fault when you have to do those before and after reels. And it's like before and it goes whoop, and then after. So, of course, people that
and I think sometimes it's so slight, like maybe in the case of your film, like All Quiet, it could be so subtle that people don't even notice. It's like, what did you guys even do, right?
Yeah, and then of course they think that, oh, he used the dinosaur button right next to the space.
Yeah.
And, but they don't know that's actually 20 people sweating over one shot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, lastly, what are some of your favorite visual effects in films, excluding present company?
Oh, I'd have to go old school, like
I love
seeing
old
that
school
first Star
answers.
Wars in the theater the first time, that was just kind of amazing. That's probably one of the things that made me think, I wonder how they did that, and probably be fun to do, wouldn't it?
Especially now when, like all the technology we have, it's like, oh, like 45 years ago, they actually did that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I also remember, of course, aside from Star Wars and knowing that, it was all done on the Oxberry, where it's like, Jesus.
Yeah.
But I remember there was also a point, I don't know, when the first Matrix film came out. I remember, going to the theater in Berkeley with our comping leads, and we came out and we were all quiet and we all thought we got to quit our jobs because how the hell?
Yeah, that was pretty ingenious. Yeah.
That's also inspiring, though, even though you might want to quit for a split second, but it's like they did that. It's like,
yeah, you just think, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to do this. And then years later, it's like, yeah, So.
Yeah, I think we've been pretty lucky to be doing what we do, in this era. I think like Jurassic Park was the second film I worked on, so we're just in the right time at the right place for all these things and this new tool of computer graphics, coming together and allowing us to think about how we do all these things.
Yeah. And it was so expensive. It's like, the only thing that could do that was those silicon graphics, that cost as much as a house back then, And now
yeah, exactly. Like 65 shots for that whole film, if I remember right. And I think now you've got to do that on average per week. You just have to, Yeah.
Well, it was great speaking with both of you. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on both of your films. They're incredible. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you.